بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome you all to this new series that I'm starting called After the Prophet. As many of you may recall, over the past 4 years, I did a podcast on the life of the Prophet from the pre-Islamic era to the death of the Prophet. And that podcast was called The Life of Prophet Muhammad. And we ended that podcast with the tragic death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, in the weeks after completing that podcast, I was inundated with messages from brothers and sisters all around the world requesting that I continue the podcast, but focus on the events that transpired after the death of the Prophet, essentially looking at the early history of Islam, perhaps the first 200 or 250 years of the early history of Islam, and with specific focus on the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. So, with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is the intention. So, this series is a collaboration between Tasneem Institute and the Ahlul Bayt American Society. And the intention, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants us the tawfiq, is to delve into the details of what occurred in the immediate aftermath of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and continue the discussion until we reach the 12th Imam of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Now, before we begin, I think an important question that we have to address is, why should we focus so much on the early history of Islam, especially when we're dealing with a period in our history that is controversial, that is very sensitive, and that may fuel the flames of sectarian tension. You know, people often ask, why don't we just focus on messages of unity and community harmony? Why is it that we insist on addressing the past? Some may say, let us leave the past in the past. Why not focus on the present and the future? Well, my dear brothers and sisters, as Muslims, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He invites believers to reflect on the past. And sometimes we have to reflect on the ugly aspects of the past, because from the past we learn very important lessons. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us in the Quran about the first murder that took place in human history, the murder that took place in the family, in the household of Adam alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us about the iniquities of past nations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He admonishes and He rebukes the children of Israel for the crimes of their ancestors. Now, if you look at these verses, especially the Madani verses, there are verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet to invoke some of the dark periods of the history of Bani Israel. For example, if we look at Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah number 2, verse 92, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to the Prophet, and keep in mind that in Medina, there was a large Jewish diaspora. There was a sizable Jewish audience. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet to bring up a very sensitive issue relating to the history of the Israelites. In ayah 92 of Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ مُوسَى بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ. Surely Moses came to you with clear signs. ثُمَّ اتَّخَذْتُمُ الْعِجْلَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ وَأَنْتُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. And yet you took the calf as an object of worship while you were wrongdoers. Now, the immediate audience of the Prophet, the Jews who were living in Medina, none of them were worshipping a golden calf. Yet, the Prophet is commanded to bring this historical event to light. The question is why? It's because according to the Quran, a believer must condemn and disassociate from the wrongdoings of the past, even if those wrongs were committed by your own ancestors. If you are going to be a believer who condemns oppression and wrongdoing in the present, you have to first begin by addressing the wrongs of the past. So this is something that we see throughout the Quran, constantly taking our attention to the past. Because if we start to censor the crimes of the past, we will be more likely to censor the crimes of the present. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the believer to disassociate from the oppressors and the criminals and those who perpetrated crimes in the past, so that in the present we can be true callers of justice. We can be true custodians of the truth. Now, with that said, my dear brothers and sisters, when it comes to the early history of Islam, there is no doubt that we will be addressing some of the most sensitive and controversial topics, some of the most controversial events. And the intention is not to engage in sectarian rhetoric. The intention is not to create a rift between our Sunni brothers and sisters. What we ultimately want is to create a community that sincerely seeks the truth and seeks to emulate the prophetic way. But in order for us to arrive at the true prophetic sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we have to visit some of the uncomfortable periods of our past. Now, with that said, we've understood that reflecting on history is an important aspect of our faith. The Quran is replete with stories of the past, with condemnations of the wrongdoings and the iniquities of past nations. And all of this is to develop within ourselves a love for truth, a love for justice, and an abhorrence towards everything that is ungodly. The Prophet ﷺ, according to many traditions found in the likes of Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, the Prophet actually spoke about and he prophesied the dark times that would come after his demise. There's one tradition that I'd like to share where Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, who was one of the prominent companions of the Prophet, he reports the following narration from Rasulullah. He says that he heard the Prophet one day say to his companions, لَتَتَّبِعُنَّ سُنَنَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ حَذْوَ الْقُدَّةِ بِالْقُدَّةِ حَذْوَ الْقُدَّةِ بِالْقُدَّةِ. The Prophet, he says, you will surely follow the ways of those who came before you inch by inch and step by step. حَتَّى لَوْ دَخَلُوا جُحْرَ ضَبٍّ لَدَخَلْتُمُوهُ. You will follow the ways of those who came before you inch by inch and step by step, to the extent that if they entered a lizard hole, you'd enter it too. This was an expression that you will imitate and emulate the ways of those who came before you to the T. So the companions, they asked the Prophet, قِيلَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ الْيَهُودُ وَالنَّصَارَى. Are we, the Muslims, are we going to follow in the footsteps of the Jews and the Christians? Are we going to make the same mistakes that they made? Are we going to fall into the same pitfalls that they did? And this is where the Prophet says, فَمَنْ. The Prophet affirms. And he says, indeed, this is precisely what is going to happen. So, not only does the Quran urge us to reflect and to ponder over the past, the Prophet ﷺ also prophesizes that there will be deviation after his death. that the Muslims will essentially repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. We will make the same mistakes as the Jews and the Christians. Now, why is this significant? Because after the death of the Prophet, we still need to make an effort to ascertain what the Sunnah of the Prophet really was. What is the halal and the haram of Muhammad ibn Abdullah? What represent the true teachings of the Prophet? So because of this inevitable deviation that will occur according to the words of the Prophet, that means that we have to be very careful in the way that we navigate the early history of Islam. Because there are many individuals after the death of the Prophet who put themselves forward as the representatives of the prophetic way, the upholders of the Sunnah of the Prophet. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala very clearly tells us in the Quran, in Surah Al-Mumtahana, verse 13, He addresses the believers and He says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, la tatawallaw qawman ghadib Allahu alayhim. O you who believe, do not take as your guardians, as your awliya, individuals who have incurred the wrath of God. So when we study the early history of Islam, we are looking for spiritual guardians, individuals who will take us by the hand and lead us to the way of the Prophet. And because there are many people who claim to be transmitters of the Sunnah, we have to do our due diligence to ensure that we are not making individuals who have committed great sins or who deviated from the prophetic way as our spiritual guardians. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la tatawallaw qawman ghadib Allahu alayhim. So we have to identify who are the ones who changed the Sunnah of the Prophet, who are the ones who adulterated the Sunnah of the Prophet, and we need to denounce those individuals. We need to distance ourselves from those individuals. And we have to also investigate and discover who were those individuals who were steadfast and who preserved the prophetic way. And we need to identify them and embrace them as our guardians so that they can take us to the way of the Prophet. Now, the first event that we need to cover after the death of the Prophet is the event of Saqifah. Now, to provide you a little bit of background, it's important for us to know that Saqifah was a private meeting that was organized by the Ansar to discuss the future leadership of the Muslim community. So, after the death of the Prophet, the Ansar, who represent the majority of the Prophet's companions, when you look at the Sahaba, you can divide the companions of the Prophet into two major groups. You have the Muhajirin, right? The emigrants, those who embraced Islam during the Meccan period and who emigrated from Mecca to Medina, who left behind their homes, who faced great persecution. These are the Muhajirin, the emigrants. And then you have the Ansar, and these are the native inhabitants of the ancient city of Yathrib, which later became known as Medina. These are the Ansar. These are those early Muslims who gave refuge to the Prophet after there was an assassination attempt on his life. They are the ones who supported the Prophet. They are the ones who made sacrifices to accommodate the new coming Muhajirin. And they constitute the majority of the Sahaba. Now, among the Ansar, you have these two major tribes. You have the Aus and the Khazraj. And understanding these demographics and these groups will help us gain a more nuanced understanding of the event of Saqifah. So contrary to what many may think, Saqifah was not organized by Abu Bakr and Umar. It was actually organized by the Ansar. And it was only later that Abu Bakr and Umar discovered that this meeting took place, and they rushed to essentially crash the meeting. Now, the term Saqifah literally means a covered shelter or a canopy. And when we say Saqifah, we're referring to Saqifat Bani Sa'ida. This basically was a clan of the Ansar. And Saqifat Bani Sa'ida, they're one of the most prominent clans among the Ansar. They organized this meeting immediately after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, when you look at the books of history, the details of Saqifah have been narrated at length by Muslim historians, Sunni and Shia alike. Now, before we go into the details of what transpired in Saqifah, what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin by sharing with you a narration where Umar ibn Al-Khattab speaks about Saqifah. And this narration is mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari. So before we go into the nitty-gritty details, I want to just share with you some comments that Umar ibn Al-Khattab makes that will really set the tone for our discussion. And it will highlight why it's important for us to actually investigate more deeply into the incident of Saqifah. Now, the primary narrative concerning the assembly at Saqifah, where the succession of Abu Bakr to the Prophet was determined, originates from Abdullah ibn Abbas. Abdullah ibn Abbas is perhaps the most important narrator of the events of Saqifah. And essentially all of the subsequent accounts that we have either draw from his reports or they expand on what was mentioned by Ibn Abbas. The narration that I'd like to share with you in this first episode to set the tone for our discussion is the narration in Sahih al-Bukhari reported by Ibn Abbas, and you can find this narration in Kitab al-Hudud. Ibn Abbas, he reports the following. He says, كنت أقرئ رجالا من المهاجرين. He says, I used to teach the recitation of the Quran to some of the men from among the Muhajirin. You know, Ibn Abbas was known for his proficiency in Quran, and he was a teacher of the Quran to many of the Muslims. Among them was Abdul Rahman ibn Auf. So he says, I used to teach the Quran to some of the men of the Muhajirin, including Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, who was a prominent companion of the Prophet. فبينما أنا في منزله بمنى وهو عند عمر ibn Al-Khattab في آخر حجة حجها إذ رجع إلي عبد الرحمن. The hadith begins by saying, Ibn Abbas says that I was in Mina with Abdul Rahman ibn Auf. I was at his campsite, and this was during the final Hajj of Umar ibn Al-Khattab. So Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, he went to go and visit Umar during his last Hajj, right? فقال لولا رأيت رجلا أتى أمير المؤمنين اليوم. So Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, he says to Abdullah ibn Abbas, if only you had seen a man who came to the commander of the faithful, he means Umar, if only you had seen a man come to him today and say, يا أمير المؤمنين هل لك في فلان يقول لو قد مات عمر لقد بايعت فلانا فوالله ما كانت بيعة أبي بكر إلا فلت فتمت. So Abdul Rahman ibn Auf is relating an incident to Abdullah ibn Abbas. Abdul Rahman ibn Auf is saying that there was a man who came to Umar and he said to Umar, "O Umar, what is your opinion about so-and-so who claims if Umar were to die, I would pledge allegiance to so-and-so?" And the person, he says to Umar, by Allah, the pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr was nothing but a hasty event, yet it succeeded. So here you have someone coming to Umar during the end of his life, during his last Hajj, and he's saying that there are people among the Muslims, perhaps among the residents of Medina, who are saying that when Umar dies, we're going to give bay'ah to such and such person. And we're basically going to do what was done in Saqifah. That in the same way that a unilateral decision was made and Abu Bakr was appointed as Khalifa, we're going to do the same thing after the death of Umar. The hadith in Bukhari says, فَغَضِبَ Umar. Umar became angry when he heard that this type of talk was happening. ثم قال إني إن شاء الله لقائم العشية في الناس. Umar became so angry that he says, by Allah's will, I will stand before the people this evening فَمُحَذِّرُهُمْ هَؤُلَاءِ الَّذِينَ يُرِيدُونَ أَن يَغْصِبُوهُمْ أُمُورَهُم. Umar says that this evening in Mina, I'm going to stand and I'm going to address the people. And I'm going to warn them about these individuals who seek to usurp their affairs. قال عبد الرحمن. Abdul Rahman, he says that I said to Umar, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, la taf'al. Don't give a speech about Saqifah. Don't give a speech about the Khilafah of Abu Bakr. Why? فإن الموسم يجمع رعاع الناس وغوغاءهم. Because the season of Hajj, it gathers the common people, the riffraff. فإنهم هم الذين يغلبون على قربك حين تقوم في الناس. Because these types of people, the commoners, the riffraff, they are the ones who are going to surround you when you give a speech in Mina. وأنا أخشى أن تقوم فتقول مقالة يطيرها عنك كل مطير. Abdul Rahman is warning Umar that be careful. I am afraid that you might stand and say something, and then every listener will carry it in their own way, misquoting or misunderstanding it. وأن لا يعوها وأن لا يضعوها على مواضعها. I'm afraid that the people will not comprehend its full meaning, nor place your words in their proper context. Abdul Rahman ibn Auf is warning Umar, don't give a speech about Saqifah in Mina, because people are going to misunderstand. People are not going to contextualize your words. So what's the alternative? What is the recommendation that Abdul Rahman ibn Auf is giving Umar? He says, فَأَمْهِلْ حَتَّى تَقْدَمَ الْمَدِينَةِ. Delay giving this speech until you reach Medina. فَإِنَّهَا دَارُ الْهِجْرَةِ وَالسُّنَّةِ. Because Medina is the place of migration, it's the place of the hijrah, it's the place of the sunnah. فَتَخْلُصَ بِأَهْلِ الْفِقْهِ وَأَشْرَافِ النَّاسِ. In Medina, if you stand and you give a speech, you will find people of knowledge and the nobles of the community. فَتَقُولَ مَا قُلْتَ مُتَمَكِّنًا. And you can speak your words with full confidence. فَيَعِي أَهْلُ الْعِلْمِ مَقَالَتَكَ وَيَضَعُونَها عَلَى مَوَاضِعِهَا. The people of understanding, they will grasp what you say, and they will place your words in their proper context. So the hadith, the narration in Bukhari says, فَقَالَ عُمَرْ أَمَا وَاللَّهِ إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَأَقُومَنَّ بِذَلِكَ أَوَّلَ مَقَامٍ أَقُومُهُ بِالْمَدِينَةِ. Umar, he says, by Allah, if Allah wills, I will address this matter at the very first opportunity I have upon returning to Medina. Umar agrees that it's best to address this topic, address this issue upon returning to Medina. The narration is very lengthy, so I'll fast forward to the part that is relevant to our discussion. So Umar, he basically, when he comes back from Hajj, he returns to Medina and he prepares to give this sermon. Abdullah ibn A.B.A.S is sitting in the audience, And he says to some of those who are around him that, Umar is going to give an unprecedented speech. He's going to speak about things that he had never spoken about before. So everyone is eagerly waiting for this speech, and then Umar begins. And among the things that Umar ibn Al-Khattab says in this speech that he gives at the end of his life, after he was bothered by the talks about what would happen after his death and how people would just give bay'ah to so-and-so after his death, Umar, he says, ثُمَّ إِنَّهُ بَلَغَنِي أَنَّ قَائِلًا مِّنْكُمْ يَقُولُ وَاللَّهِ لَوْ مَاتَ عُمَرْ بَايَعْتُ فُلَانًا. He says in his speech, he said, it has reached me. Who's speaking? Umar ibn Al-Khattab. He's giving a formal speech in Medina. He says, it has reached me that someone among you is saying, by Allah, if Umar were to die, I would pledge allegiance to so-and-so. And it's interesting that the individual is not mentioned. Perhaps it's Ali ibn Abi Talib. In any case, the hadith doesn't mention, the narration doesn't mention. It says, by Allah, that it has reached me that someone among you is saying, by Allah, if Umar were to die, I would pledge allegiance to so-and-so. And then he says, فَلَا يَغْتَرَّنَّ امْرُؤٌ أَن يَقُولَ إِنَّمَا كَانَتْ بَيْعَةُ أَبِي بَكْرٍ فَلْتَ وَتَمَّتْ أَلَا وَإِنَّهَا قَدْ كَانَتْ كَذَلِكَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ وَقَى شَرَّهَا. Umar, he says, let no one be deceived into thinking that the pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr was merely a hasty decision that succeeded. Indeed, listen to this, indeed it is as you say, it was a hasty event, it was a sudden event, but Allah protected the community from its potential harm. And then he says, وَلَيْسَ مِنْكُمْ مَنْ تُقْطَعُ الْأَعْنَاقُ إِلَيْهِ مِثْلُ أَبِي بَكْرٍ. Umar, he says, and there is none among you whose leadership is universally accepted as Abu Bakr's was. And by the way, this is not true, and we will speak about that in our subsequent episodes. And then look at what Umar says. مَنْ بَايَعَ رَجُلًا عن غير مشورة من المسلمين فلا يبايع هو ولا الذي بايعه تغرة أن يقتلا. And this is the line that I wanted to bring your attention to. Umar, he says, whoever pledges allegiance to someone without consultation of the Muslims, neither that person nor the one he pledged allegiance to should be recognized. Their actions risk leading both of them to being killed. Now, if the Khilafah of Abu Bakr was indeed based on consultation, on shura, why would Umar ibn Al-Khattab become upset when he hears that the Muslims want to appoint a Khalifa in the same way that Abu Bakr was appointed? So the fact that Umar is insisting that the Khalifa who was chosen must be chosen in consultation with the Muslims indicates that that is not how Abu Bakr was appointed. So this narration, my dear brothers and sisters, in Sahih al-Bukhari, it sheds light on the deep political tensions of that era. You find that the issue of Saqifah was charged even towards the end of the Khilafah of Umar ibn Al-Khattab. It was still a very sensitive topic. Now, when Umar ibn Al-Khattab, in that narration that I shared with you, and I just gave you some excerpts of it, it's important to note that Umar ibn Al-Khattab's intention was not to provide the public with a transparent account of what transpired at Saqifah. And that is why He's being warned, not to deliver the sermon in Mina. Abdul Rahman is telling him that you have to be careful. This is a very sensitive issue. Instead, what you see in the narration from Umar is that his focus was on addressing a growing faction within the Muslim community that was rallying support for a particular individual to assume leadership after his death. So, the narration from Umar doesn't specify the name of the individual who is being sought after for leadership after him. But Umar's speech, what's interesting is that on the one hand, he uses Saqifah to discredit this process and to highlight that Khilafah must be based on consultation. So you find that what's interesting is that on the one hand, Umar ibn Al-Khattab is trying to uphold the legitimacy of Saqifah because that is how Abu Bakr came to power. And Umar ibn Al-Khattab rose to power because he was appointed by Abu Bakr. But at the same time, he's warning the Muslims after him that they should not follow that same practice. Now, some may say that, the consultation happened gradually and there was a consensus that Abu Bakr should be the Khalifa. That's also not true. And we'll see that there was intimidation and there was violence that was used to establish the ad hoc government after the Prophet. So Umar's narrative about Saqifah is politically charged, as it does not provide a full account of the event, but rather his entire speech focuses on preventing the disruption of the status quo. As we saw, Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, fearing the consequences of Umar delivering such a sensitive speech in Mina, he advised him to wait until they returned to Medina. This highlights the delicate and the controversial nature of what transpired at Saqifah and the ongoing tension surrounding its legacy. The reason why this is important, brothers and sisters, is because if the process was truly based on consultation, as the Quran and the Sunnah demand, then why would Umar warn against repeating it? And why would he describe it as something spontaneous and potentially harmful? These contradictions raise questions about the legitimacy and the transparency of the proceedings at Saqifah. What we know, my dear brothers and sisters, and what we will discover in our discussions is that the events at Saqifah did not represent the collective will of the residents of Medina, let alone the broader Muslim community, which stretched as far south as Yemen and as far north as Sham. The legitimacy of Abu Bakr's leadership also calls into question the legitimacy of Umar's succession. If Umar's rule was based on the precedent set at Saqifah, it becomes clear that there was no structured consultative process. Instead, the entire system relied on hurried decisions and political maneuvering, as Umar himself admits when he described the Pledge of Allegiance to Abu Bakr as nothing but a falta. Inshallah, in our next episode, we'll walk the respected listeners and viewers through the events of Saqifah, and we'll examine the dialogue that took place at Saqifah Bani Sa'ada, and we will leave the conclusions to our listeners, and inshallah we will see exactly how Abu Bakr rose to power and what was the reaction and the response of the household of Ali and Fatima. Inshallah, we'll leave that discussion for our next episode. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.